Hey guys, welcome to the Disruptors, the show where we get the folks that are quite literally building the future. Today, without question, we have one of them, George Church. George, thanks for coming today.
Oh, my pleasure.
We'll talk all about your introduction and incredible background in the intro to this. So I wanted to jump into what I think is probably the most important question for someone in your position, and that's how in God's name do you prioritize what to work on with so many possibilities?
Well, the possibilities are definitely greater than when I was a student, not just for me, but for everybody. In that when I was a student, you had to decide whether you were going to do something that was pure science, something that was technology, something that was disruptive technology, or something that was socially impactful, like clinically or otherwise. And now you can do all at once. And so I'm looking for cases where we can really max out all at once. Now that sounds overly ambitious, but it's much easier than it used to be. And it also helps that the particular thing that we picked, the thing that I picked over the years, was to be interdisciplinary and exponential technologies. I didn't know that's what I was doing when I started, but that's in a certain sense what we've been doing. And so that combination of those two things makes it relatively easy to choose what to do next. And finally, there's the whole adage of buy low, sell high. That's not actually a recipe or an algorithm. It usually means that somebody's got a lot of experience, and I think we have a lot of experience of finding undervalued technologies, things that people think are either impossible or forever expensive or worthless, and we just go and scoop them up and make them work.
Basically, you have the world's greatest job. You get to make magic and actually make it happen. That's that's where the incredible beard has come from, I imagine. Knowledge and insight. So why did you choose synthetic biology? Why did you get into chemistry and some of the fields that you're in now? What was the initial origin of that?
Well, quite frankly, ever since I was a kid, I was interested in every aspect of science, and I never really wanted to specialize within that specialty. And so I just sought out fields where you needed to be interdisciplinary. And the first one I found was X-ray crystallography of biological macromolecules, and that required, the physics of diffraction, the math of Fourier transforms, the chemistry of bonds, and then the biology of macromolecules. And ever since then, I've been looking at ways that you can apply those strategies of automation and multiplexing to basically every other field. And synthetic biology was a fairly good choice. Anything that's basic and enabling allows you to defer specialization.
Is it fair to say synthetic biology will be to this century what compute and digital was to the last?
I think it's actually bigger than what compute and digital was because since it's the software, hardware, manufacturing, and design are all so much more intimately connected. I mean, it's clearly in the electronics industry you have computer-aided design and manufacturing, but that's just that you typically use it to build electronic circuits, say. Well, with biology you can probably build everything, including electronic circuits or the moral equivalent of them.
Fair point. How do you bring that expertise together? Because you do need both sides of the equation to be able to be successful. Like you said, you have an interesting mind that explores a lot of fields, and yet most people in traditional education especially, you kind of pick your one thing and you zoom in on that and almost never touch anything else.
Yeah, I think it's an acquired taste. It's bitter to some people to try to wrap your head around too many things. I guess it's like anything. If you work at it long enough, you get better at it, or if you start at it earlier, it helps too. I take, and my team takes deep dives on some subjects, and if you take enough poke enough deep dives, it's not just shallow coverage of a large number of fields. You have kind of an interesting perspective, and it help and very often one field will help you solve a problem in another. So it's got its disadvantages and advantages.
What's the most pressing problem or thing you're working on today? If you had to pick one thing and choose that as the favorite child, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, that's not my forte. Is choosing favorite, but I would say, well, there are two ways of if you want to prioritize at that level. One would be which is the most basic technology, and I would say that's reading and writing DNA. That underpins our ability to read and write all kinds of things. You could say reading and writing are two different things. I'm cheating, but actually I think they're intimately connected. It's hard to write a book or DNA without being able to read it, and vice versa. It's hard to read something until you've written it. So I think those are. So I'm going to call that one thing. And then if I had to pick one thing that's most enabling to me personally, or to scientists, would be aging reversal. It's like if a genie gives you one wish, that wish should be for 1,000 wishes. And so if you want, I'm just now getting to the point where I think I'm an actual productive member of society after 65 years of programming myself. I'm finally fairly functional, and it would be a pity to recycle me at this point.
I'm going to call bullshit on you just getting to be a productive member of society. I think you've accomplished a ton, George. Speaking,
well,
humbleness is one of those key attributes, especially for leaders, though. So, speaking of what you've done in the past, you talked about reading and writing. You were kind of there at the ground floor. What was that like when it seemed impossible and impossibly expensive?
Well, it didn't seem completely impossible in the sense that when I started, there was synthetic organic chemistry. It wasn't just at the dawn of synthetic chemistry of nucleic acids, thanks to Gobind Khorana. And there was certainly reading of nucleic acids. Usually they were restricted to being sort of, tens to maybe 100 base pairs, mostly transfer RNAs. And that happened to be what I worked on, was transfer RNAs, which was the kind of the ground zero for both reading and writing of nucleic acids. And I was doing neither. I was doing the three-dimensional structure of it, which is another aspect of reading, I guess.
And then the Human Genome Project. How did you get?
So it didn't seem impossible, but it did seem like it was an awfully long way to go from being able to read 76 base pairs and maybe write 76 to being able to read and write a human genome, which was 6 billion base pairs if you count both the mothers and the fathers, and then doing 7 billion of us, each with 6 billion base pairs, just seemed daunting. But it seemed to me that it was just a matter of bringing down the cost, and that's what I've been doing basically ever since then. That was roughly when I was 19 that I started getting the bug of sequencing and to a lesser extent later synthesis.
And the Human Genome Project, it was something like $1 billion in 15 years.
It was $1 a base for a haploid genome, 3 billion base pairs, $3 billion. But I never accepted that as the correct goal. I felt the correct goal was to do both of your genomes of a cell. To be clinically relevant, you have to analyze both your mother's and your father's contributions to your genome, which is twice as much, and you have to keep them unentangled, and it has to be cheaper than $3 billion. I just felt that 3 billion for 3 billion was completely the wrong two goals. It should be, more like $1,000 for 6 billion, or maybe even less money than that. And we eventually got there, but I think the Genome Project itself was a bit of a waste because it was too much money and not enough new results.
What do you think in terms of the next big? Because the Genome Project was multi-country. That was international effort, right?
Yeah.
What do you think the next big human level challenge of something like this is? Is it tackling climate change? Is it tackling something else in terms of health and longevity? What are the ones you would like to see people unite around, and why?
Well, I'm a believer that that the Genome Project shouldn't have been a big project. I mean, international is great; it's good to share, but I think it should have been a project of a very small number of people can bring down the price radically, and then you deploy it worldwide in kind of almost a consumer-driven way. I mean, it can be through physicians and so forth. So I think the big things, the things that are worldwide, are things that involve, shared, often capitalistic, driven, shared models. So, like the internet, like in this case, personal genomics. So we started various efforts to bring the price down to $0, like Nebula Genomics, and make it private and safe, but still shareable. So I think that's a big. Everybody should get their genomes, to at least have the ability to get their genome sequences. A personal choice as to exactly what you do with it, or if you do it. But I think it'd be valuable if everybody got it, and ideally if everybody shared it.
What do you think about the safety of that in terms of insurance companies screwing you ahead of time?
Well, so Nebula, we've established a way that you can ask questions of your genome without ever having an unencrypted version of it. So even you don't have your genome. And so you can get the value of a genome, for example, preventing, if you have like a rare genetic disease, that's like one, a few bits of information that you go and check out. That can be done by homomorphic encryption queries without having an unencrypted form. So the insurance company, you can hand them the encrypted form, but it won't do them any good. You can prove to them that you haven't gamed the insurance business, and it's against the law in the United States anyway for the health insurers and employers to discriminate. But even if that law were reversed tomorrow, if you have homomorphic encryption, you can get all the benefits without the downside. But I think this is one of the reasons that we have this paradox. We have nearly $0 genome and almost nobody getting it, is because up until this year, there wasn't a way to do secure and safe, private, medically relevant queries.
And like with Facebook and Equifax, if you're not paying for the product, you are a piece of the product.
Correct.
Which is
so yes, if you don't know the business model, then you're in trouble. But if in the case there are $0 products where you're not the product. So for example, Wikipedia, I would say, is a $0 product to some extent. Map and searches, the worst happens is you see a few ads. But Facebook's a different matter altogether. But I think there are $0 products. And in the case of genomics, the $0, the reason that you can get $0 without being the product is Mendelian diseases cost trillions of dollars. About $10 trillion could be saved if we could solve those. And therefore, people should be incentivized, or certainly not disincentivized, by having have to pay a lot of money.
Let's play devil's advocate. To do it and do it effectively, you have to have a single payer healthcare system. Otherwise, if you have the system the US has now, then they're not sure, the insurance company's not sure if I'm going to churn next year. So they could give a shit if I die next year, as long as I don't die this year.
That's correct. But I politely disagree in that I think that there's such a big return on investment. So there's about $1 million to $5 million, depending on who does the estimate, per severe Mendelian disease. It's about 5% of the population. If you run the numbers, an insurance company could, the churn rate. I mean, these are all facts that their actuarial staff can sort out. But the churn, even if you assume worst case churn, historical data, you still have a 10-to-1 return on investment. So you can just throw the rest of it out the window. I mean, it's just the price of doing business. But the cost of the genome is so low now, and the return is so big. I mean, the cost is now getting down around $300, and the return is millions of dollars for the 5% of the population. So I think there is business model. It's just going to take a while for confidence to build in that business model.
Interesting. Speaking of confidence, we've seen some very confident efforts out of China in terms of what we can do with the technology. Where do you think, obviously, we will head that direction? Do you think we'll see humanity splintering into multiple species?
Well, first of all, I don't buy the argument of inevitability, but nevertheless, it's a good question of whether we will speciate. I think to some extent we have already speciated, not due to genetic technology, but due to technology. So there are many Aboriginal and indigenous and untechnological societies, hundreds of them worldwide, and they do not want to breed with us. So they will throw spears at our helicopters when we try to save them after a quote, save them after a tsunami. So that's one form of speciation. It's cultural and geographic. In terms of genetics, I think the direction may be the opposite, which is that we diversify intentionally, but diversify in a way that's interoperable. So in other words, if you you look in our technological cities, there's a wide diversity of products, and a growing number of them are interoperable, not always. And for example, I think we're despeciating rather than speciating, in the sense that we have animals now where we've taken a jellyfish gene, put it into a mouse or into a plant. We've taken CRISPR from a bacteria and put it into almost every other organism. We're basically becoming one species by the definition of exchanging DNA. We basically can exchange DNA between any two species. So I think that particular species definition is evaporating. But if you talk about, I think also in terms of socioeconomics, we have the wherewithal, and we're exploiting occasionally, of making some technologies available to everybody. So this is, your theme is disruption. I mean, I think that there are some technologies who are aiming towards equitable distribution, like clean water and electronics, like access to cell phones is getting pretty good. But there's some technologies that are better than pretty good. They're literally, everybody gets it for free, and that's like, for example, smallpox. Smallpox, when it was a vaccine, was not quite equitable because you had to have access to the pennies per vaccine dose. But now it's extinct, and so there's not even pennies. And I think we should. There are many technologies where we can radically reduce the cost in that manner to $0 to the consumer.
Do you think in terms of genetic enhancements that would come fast enough? One of the fears I have is that if we're able to alter not only in vitro babies, but if we're able to make, I'm going to get the term wrong, but essentially if I can alter myself or you can alter yourself while you're currently alive, that we could have changes fast enough. If suddenly we take George Church and you're 50 IQ points higher, you're in the best shape of your life, and you're going to live an extra 20 or 50 years, you're going to have a very different interest in women. You're going to want them to be smart and sexy and living longer, etc. Do you see that as a potential spiral?
Yeah, I think you've correctly, more astutely than the average person commenting on this topic, have seen that the threat is not germline enhancement, it is adult enhancement. Seems like all the obsession is about germline, but it takes like 80 years to debug an anti-Alzheimer's germline therapy, and that kind of design, build, test cycle is just uneconomic. So you don't need to regulate it. It's gonna be very hard. But yes, in adults, you have a very quick design cycle in principle, where you could see an improvement in cognition or immunity or just robustness of your health as you get an aging reversal. Yeah, I mean, I think what we have to be cautious that we will create perpetuate and exaggerate have and have not. But one strategy why biology, I think, has the potential of being even better than cell phones, which are getting to the point where you have 6 billion cell phones, not quite equitably distributed. I think we can do even better with biology because in principle, biology is free. I mean, you look at the forests of the world, I mean, you just look at the world from the sky and there's all this biological stuff that's atomically precise, made at scale, and it basically just needs carbon dioxide and sunlight. Now, how you turn, the reason that therapies are expensive is because the fixed costs of safety engineering and testing, and I'm a big fan of the Food and Drug Administration, but in order to get that level of safety with the historical uncertainties required on the order of $1 billion per drug. Now, it's really more like $100 million a drug, maybe even less, but you have to amortize all the failures as well. So the more failures, and the failure rate was somewhere between 80% and more recently maybe 70 or 60%. But the point is, you have to include those. So if we can reduce the failure rate, that'll help. But also if we increase the market. So if the fixed cost is $1 billion and the market is 7 billion people, then you're talking about something that's getting potentially equitable. And an example of something where the market could be big is aging reversal. Most other, your typical gene therapy would be a tiny market of hundreds of people. And that's the problem with orphan drugs. They're extraordinarily expensive. Gene therapies are as well for rare diseases. But if you get something where everybody can benefit, then you can spread that cost out. But this has to be a conscious effort. Not necessarily every government has to regulate it, but somebody, some disruptor, has to think out of the box to how to make the cost dirt cheap.
And what are your thoughts on IP or the need to open source? Is this something where that is very dangerous if we don't or we do?
Some people argue both ways, that it's dangerous if we do and dangerous if we don't. It's dangerous if we do in the sense that it puts incredible power of life and death for, of millions of people in the hands of one person. It's dangerous if we don't in the sense that since we would like to believe there are many, many more good intentioned people than bad, then you want to have the good intentioned people to have the wherewithal, the research and development tools to do what's necessary to prevent, at a minimum, emerging infectious diseases, emerging diseases of affluence, because that's the real enemy. Anyway, you can argue both ways. I think the net is on the side of open source. There are probably, yeah, that would be my inclination.
What do you think about the good-willed but woefully ignorant? You know what you don't know. You don't always know what you don't know.
Right.
Someone releasing something into the wild with vastly unintended consequences.
Right. So, yeah, I think as engineers, we tend to be ignorant, and it is remarkable how much good can be done with vast ignorance. That's not an excuse or a recommendation. It is, for example, smallpox, which I already mentioned. We were so ignorant that we didn't even have names for virology and immunology when we started applying the smallpox principle. And even by the time of extinction, we were still woefully ignorant. Now, the question is, and I think as we go forward, many of these things we're getting much better at sort of accurate science fiction, of Hollywood depiction of all these negative scenarios, of engagement of people in both the fictionalized and the documentary versions, that it really will be harder and harder to do something through ignorance. It will probably become less and less motivating to do it willfully, because you're going to be hurting your family, yourself, in some cases, and there are alternatives. I mean, if your goal is to obtain, wealth or health or just good happiness for your family, there are probably more practical ways to do that than causing a pandemic.
There definitely are, but Zuckerberg's doing his best to make the world a better place by uniting everyone on Facebook, and we're seeing some unintended consequences of that.
Yeah, fair enough.
If you had to guess the cause of a post-apocalyptic tomorrow, what would it be and why?
Well, you won't like my first top choice, which is asteroid. But nevertheless, I think there are biotechnological things we can do to deal with the asteroid. For example, dealing with the biological challenges, the space travel, getting us, establishing colonies throughout our solar system and beyond. The second one, if I had to pick something that was more biological, I suppose a pandemic. And the reason I say that is because we're more well stirred than ever before. That is to say, we travel more. We don't hesitate to go out of the home and send our kids to daycare without determining what it is that they're suffering from. As long as they don't have 104 temperature, the fact they're projectile vomiting is fine. So I think that we're quite capable of pandemics, not through biotechnology, but just through the technology of travel. It used to be that most people would be born and die within a few meters, of their original home. And that's, they'd live in little villages that would never exchange material with much material other than trade routes. So, and even those were limited, but I think that's completely changed. So that would be my top biological risk.
So let's say Elon hops in his little driverless car and drives over to your lab and says, "George, I need your help. We got to get people on Mars." What do you tell him in terms of time horizon, both near and far, in terms of conservative and aggressive, when you think that we would be at the point where we could alter humanity enough to be able to withstand those types of conditions? Not without spacesuits, obviously, but just in general, adapting ourselves.
Well, I think that probably we could do it already. It would just be quite uncomfortable and shorter lives and so forth. We have some people that have stayed a year or so out in space, weightless. There's a lot of fluid problems and bone problems that are not fixed even on returning to Earth gravity. Even Mars is pretty low gravity. It's 38%, and our body just was not made for 38%. You can generate artificial gravity with centrifuges, but that's impractical so far. So I would say that there's it would be good to solve that problem both for osteoporosis on Earth and for weightless and 38% gravity. Radiation resistance is something that would probably be valuable, again, both on Earth and in space. A lot of our cancers and other inherited disorders are due to radiation. And also the kind of fixes for that might be fixes that are valuable for other kinds of DNA damage and aging. So I think those would be my top two, and they have a kind of a win-win feeling to them, and they are something that is practical in both places. But my top one of the three would be colonies. We need to practice colonies on Earth. The premise that we're just going to establish colonies on Mars, having never practiced, is amazing. It would be like I'm going to go, do Beethoven's Ninth at Carnegie Hall without ever having touched a piano. I mean, there's just ridiculous. So if we can't get people to agree to live in a completely sealed container on Earth, where if something goes wrong, you just open the door and you go to the nearest hospital, then they really shouldn't be volunteering to go to be going 20 light minutes away. and doing the same thing.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy the optimism people speak about this without really considering what the consequences would be.
But I think colonies, like the other two things, would be a win-win too, because if you establish colonies on Earth, not only you're qualifying yourself the way that astronauts qualify to go into space over a long training period, but you're also, for while you're in there, you're not going to have any infectious diseases, which is a pretty awesome concept. You'll have zero commute time, et cetera. There will be advantages. It's not just a net disadvantage. So I think there could be a economy that could spring up that kind of like trailer park, except more serious.
Seasteading as well. I could see that happening that way.
Yeah.
We have a couple people who are trying to get on the program who have been setting up a couple of people on the Hawaii colony. I think NASA was working on just experimentally. It's fascinating to look at what happens.
It has to be completely sealed with total recycling, because the thing we're doing on the International Space Station, where we're releasing things into space or sending them back to Earth and shipping, that is not really sustainable, probably. And it shouldn't be that hard. We have contained spaces that for non-human ecosystems that last for many decades. We should be able to do it for humans as well.
Mm-hmm. If I had to make you give up everything you've worked on today to this point and to choose a completely new field, one that fascinated you but you'd never really dove into, what would it be and why?
Well, that's hard, just because I've tried a lot of things. I've kissed a lot of frogs. Not too many frogs left. I mean, I can pick things that I haven't.
Let's say things you haven't gone deep into.
Yeah, there are many things I haven't been successful at. That's one. I think one that I've toyed with is carbon sequestration, and I think that we're in a position where there's a lot of talk about the climate change is not very productive. It's talking about pointing fingers, like who did it, who has to sacrifice the most to get it fixed. And we're talking about, it's kind of nickel and dime stuff. We're talking about 9 gigatons for total human consumption worldwide. Well, there are things where carbon sequestration is occurring naturally that involve not 9 gigatons, but 1,400 gigatons is the amount of carbon in the tundra or the Arctic, 19 million square kilometers. That's a lot, and you could sequester a whole lot more. You talk about seasteading. There's a lot of carbon fixed in the ocean every year. We can almost return to pre-industrial levels just by harnessing the amount that's fixed every year by the cyanobacteria in the ocean. For example, some of the previous proposals have been to feed them iron and nitrogen and phosphorus, which are the basic fertilizers, and then they'll fix the carbon and fall to the bottom of the ocean. A, that's inaccessible. B, they're taking a lot of phosphorus with them, which is a precious fertilizer component. The nitrogen and iron, that's not so precious, but the phosphorus is a big deal. So instead of sinking those down, focus on fixing carbohydrates, essentially, and leaving them on the surface. So building islands that are non-biodegradable. So less emphasis on biodegrading and more emphasis on making permanent structures. So an example of a fairly recalcitrant carbohydrate is cellulose. It's actually fairly hard to destroy wood in seawater. And so you could make, really gigantic, if you wanted to fix all the carbon that's post-industrial, that would make some pretty big islands, about the size, maybe half the size of Australia. So anyway, these are things that I clearly haven't done, but I would love to do. And I'm doing some things on the Arctic as part of the Mammoth project, and some of the things on carbon sequestration in the ocean from cyanobacterial work that I started a long time ago, but I think I still met your requirement of not having done this stuff yet.
Definitely. You teed me up for that one perfectly. So Putin goes to you in the secret meeting and tells you about this mammoth idea he's got. What is the deal here? Tell me about the Mammoth project and how you guys are trying to resurrect and fight climate change.
Yeah. So Vladimir and I do have connections to the same Mammoth Museum in Yakutsk, which is one of the key cities in Siberia. The idea there is, and there is, it was a counterintuitive idea years ago when Sergei Zimov and later his son Nikita proposed just how much carbon there is in the Arctic. It was greatly underestimated because in most ecosystems, most of the carbon is in the top meter, but in the permafrost, it goes down 500 meters. And it took a while for everybody to realize what the consequence of that was. And most of it's stabilized by ice. And so if you melt it, then you get carbon dioxide and worse yet, a lot of methane that comes from the grass roots turning into bacteria. And so then, and the main reason for this, the finger pointing for this 1,400 gigatons is not the SUVs or the smokestacks. It's 1,500 years ago, our ancestors killed off all the herbivores, and it switched from grass, which is a good photosynthetic carbon sequestration vehicle and a good reflector of light, and the herbivores tramp down the snow. It switched to these really dark kind of antennae for warming that they heat up due to their dark nature, albedo, and they trap snow, which insulates the summer temperatures away from the -40 winter wind. And the main herbivore that's missing that would shift the tree to grass ratio back to the ratio that would maintain the temperature were large, the largest herbivores, which were elephants or mammoths. And many of the mammoths and elephants were interbreedable, and various hybrids were formed, just like I'm a Neanderthal hybrid. There are lots of mammoth genes floating around. Anyway, so if you just made modern elephants more mammoth-like, then they could help with this carbon sequestration problem, which I think is better than most of the other suggestions, which are a drop in the bucket and are just slowing down the carbon problem rather than reversing it.
Does it scare you how easy it is to explain and rationalize that solution? Do you think that possibly it could be leading yourself or others into stray by seeing the solution and making it? Is it one of those things where we see it for what we want it to be? Possibly.
Oh, definitely, possibly. The thing is, the unintended consequences, I think, are less than if I were proposing, to release 1918 flu virus from the permafrost. That would be, which, some of my colleagues did sequence and make public that virus genome. That's a different matter. That's a invisible infectious agent that had a record of killing young people. This is something which is a large herbivore, and we know how to regulate the levels of herbivores. So, for example, in the Galapagos, they have more goats than they want, so they banned goats, and that's feasible. In some islands, they get rid of the rodents that are killing off their key special species like birds and lizards. So I think that's easily reversible. As we move forward, we can decide whether it's working or not. And we've already done a big experiment along these lines on bison. So bison were essentially extinct in the wild, and now there's 500,000 of them worldwide. And they didn't require a big government handout for that to occur. They're almost what we want from elephants. They just can't. They're just not very good at knocking over trees, or they choose not to. Well, the elephants love knocking over trees. I think in part, this is their solution to the giraffe problem. Rather than having a long elephant neck to get the stuff at the top, they just bring the tree down to their level.
They're smart buggers. I hear the intelligence it's not human level, but it's very high up there.
Well, I think it's probably better than some humans.
I would definitely give you that.
They have amazing emotional concern, which some humans don't, and they you know, they'll remember where their baby died and they'll come and visit it every year. So if that unfortunate thing happens, and we're not limited to the diversity that it includes all the ancient elephants plus the modern ones and all throughout the entire world, because they were global species. We can introduce new things that were not in the ancient or the modern elephants, such as resistance to herpes virus, which is a catastrophic event that's happening now. Just during my lifetime, the herpes virus epidemic has changed from a 10% of infant elephants to about getting close to 80%. So they may be extinct in our lifetime if we don't do something about the herpes virus, which is another project that we're working on, both for the elephant and for any hybrids.
So I sense a theme in some of your work, and that's that you like to have big inspiration, yet oftentimes a lot of the solutions just come from nature or nature inspired, not necessarily dreaming up the next new yada yada to fix everything, but looking to existing solutions.
Yeah, I'm very big on lowering costs and using nature to just helping nature do what it does anyway. That has the advantage that you don't have to get so entrenched in politics. Yeah, so I mean, we've brought down the price of reading and writing DNA by 10 million fold, and that's largely because we've been able to go out there and harness very sophisticated nanomachines that are just all around us. You just can't see them, but we now know how, in a certain sense, our ability to read and write DNA allows us to read and write, look through the biosphere with new goggles, vision, and then that allows us to get new machines to help us do reading and writing better, and it's kind of a virtuous positive feedback cycle. And so this is things like polymerase helps us to read, nanopores help us to read, CRISPR and tau proteins help us to write or edit. And yeah, there's a lot to be said for nature and nature-inspired technologies.
Do you think we'll get to a point within the next 50 or 100 years where it becomes not the oddity, but the absolute majority and the standard to do intensive, or let's just say at least decent scale genetic testing and selection of potential embryos when you're having a kid? So for instance, I see this guy's going to have a disease. I don't want him to have to deal with it. I see she's going to not have quite the brain. Let's up that a little bit, or let's not continue with this. Do you think that's something that's going to be a firm majority?
Yeah, I mean, it's already a firm minority, and these things have a way of spreading as long as they're safe, effective, and once word gets out there, word of mouth is going to work at least as well as government regulation and advertisement. You know, a good idea these days, because of social networks, will spread on its own.
But so will a bad idea.
So yes, that's true. So in this particular case, which is this, and will it spread? So we have, and we're not limited to in vitro fertilization as a, you know, reading a genome. There are many things that you can do. In vitro fertilization is just one of them. It's not the cheapest one, and it's also medically somewhat invasive for the mother in particular. The hormone treatments to get the eggs and so forth. An alternative is, which is much less medical and much less expensive, is matchmaking. This has been practiced, especially in the Ashkenazi community, and they've more or less eliminated their major genetic diseases, multiple diseases, simply by making sure that you don't fall in love with or marry someone who's incompatible with you. Now, it doesn't mean that you're marked with some scarlet letter. Because it's a very specific pairing thing. About 5% of would-be mates are incompatible, but you still have 95%. So your dance card list is quite large, and excluding 5% is not a big deal. You can even include a few where you're not sure, but let's bump it up to 6%. They would be considered false positives if we were in a clinical setting, but this is just matchmaking. And if you still have 94% of the opposite sex of your age group, that's still a vast number of people.
Finland does this for Tinder for a sniff test because there's such a small population in the relative area that you have a lot of first and second and third cousins. You have some problems.
Exactly. And I don't think this would be that hard to implement. I mean, to extrapolate from the success in inbred populations, including Ashkenazi in Finland and some Arab nations, to the whole population, because we can't say we're not at risk just because there's nobody in our family, because many serious Mendelian diseases, you're the first one that you know of, or you're in your family to have a child that's diseased. And that's because you just happen to run into another carrier. So it's a 5% risk. I don't feel lucky with that kind of consequence. And so I think that's a reason that everybody should get sequenced and then use it for matchmaking, as well as in vitro fertilization and other methods. I don't think it's going to be super practical to use in vitro fertilization or matchmaking to tinker with aging or intelligence. I think those will require more powerful medicine, like we talked about earlier with gene therapy or therapies. But I believe those can be made inexpensive, and they go through thorough testing. Inexpensive because so many people will use it, and because they can be made inexpensively.
And because you can do some of these tests at home. I hear you're guinea pig number one.
Yeah, I'm guinea pig number one in the Personal Genome Project and a few other projects. It's considered ethical for students to experiment on their advisor, not the reverse, because in principle, I make decisions about their career advancement. So that's one reason I'm guinea pig. But I think it's just a good idea to eat your own dog food. There are some risks, like the first punch biopsy we debugged on me, and I'm glad we did skin biopsy. Yeah, I was one of the first people to be sequenced, and I put my sequence and my medical records in the public domain, as is true for everybody in the Personal Genome Project worldwide.
Any negative consequences thus far?
I don't know of any in myself or in the cohort. There are a few positive consequences, either from sharing the genome or for sharing the medical data. In my particular case, someone gave me some great hematologists came out of nowhere and gave me some great advice on statins and cholesterol that probably added many quality years to my life. But I'm sure there will be negative consequences at some point. I mean, we're lucky in the United States to have the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act of 2008. And I think in many of the other countries, there's something equivalent that protects people. In part, it's just inconvenient to go into a kind of a specialized small database like ours and use it as a form of discrimination. Much better to discriminate based on something that's widespread.
To be fair, though, we do the discrimination based off of the widespread. Oh, she's a girl and he doesn't look like me, and yeah,
I agree.
All totally illegal. So it could be a slippery slope. Got it?
Legal, right? Legal, not illegal.
So I want to turn this around now. Where What industries are you most interested in outside of your own? And what do you look to on a daily or weekly basis to stay informed?
Oh, I'm terrible at being informed outside of my industry. In fact, I mean, I would be terrible within my industry, except there's just so many people that are motivated to keep me informed. My students, postdocs, business associates, they fill my mailbox with things that are extremely valuable to me. I'm very grateful to them. So the only reason I'm informed about other things is to the extent that I have broad interests and many things impact my little world. But no, it's all by Google searches and word of mouth, email, that sort of thing.
And your bazillion companies, how do you decide when to take a company to market when you have a technology that's worth building a business around?
Yeah, that's a good question. Usually, um, so some of my colleagues will do it when they're tired of writing grants or some other bad reason like that. I usually wait until it's fairly painfully obvious that there is a market. In other words, where I'm getting a lot of requests for something, for example, and it would be a distraction for my academic lab to satisfy those requests. Like a lot of requests for, hey, could you sequence my cousin, or could you, synthesize my plasmid for me? So those are kind of spontaneous market evaluations that bubble up. The other reason is that sometimes, increasingly, my postdoctoral fellows have decided that this is a good career path. It's not the academic path or the joining a big company path. It's the path of starting your own. And I think they've been very creative and successful so far. It'll be hard to tell, until a few years pass. But that's another motivation for starting a company. And usually that means that they and I have used the strategies that I mentioned earlier of, seeing if the market actually needs it. Sometimes we have to create or anticipate a market, but most of that we try to de-risk in academia, where creating and anticipating markets is lower risk than if you actually start a company. So we try to delay the company until we have a mature technology that has some momentum.
In general, then, what's the time to market once you have something, be it a device, be it a treatment, be it a sequencing strategy? What's the time to market look like for someone who's not familiar with biotech?
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by market. I mean, there are ways that a company can make money, by selling to pharma, but it's still not. Is the market pharma, or is the market the consumer that buys the pharmaceuticals that pharma develops? So sometimes you could get to market, meaning pharma, in like a year, and you can cash in and you're done. It's like, but then it still is going to take a decade to get through all the FDA phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. So I think 10 years is kind of a good rule of thumb for almost best case scenario for a new therapy or even a new diagnostic. An instrument rule of thumb is it takes about 5 years to go from a kind of a high quality academic publication to a turnkey system with the instruction manuals and the reagents and everything. So it's in that range, 5 to 10 years. Occasionally you'll get something, if the market is considered researchers, that can be almost instantaneous. So like CRISPR, we published in January of 2013, and by sort of March, May, there were thousands of labs that had access through Adgene, which is a nonprofit distributing plasmids. So there are some things that spread very, very quickly.
What do you think about the whole IP battle over the CRISPR tech in terms of that and then the precedent it sets?
I don't think it sets any precedent. I don't even think it's that interesting. I mean, it's a good question. It's just not, it's like, with a cell phone, there are thousands of patents involved in that. You don't say, what's the cell phone patent battle? There's there's patents and everything from like how to lay down gold and silicon, and how to compress images, and there's just thousands of things there. And I think the same thing is going to be true for gene therapies. CRISPR is just one of many subtractive, knockout therapies, and then there's lots of additive. In fact, most gene therapies are additive, which CRISPR isn't particularly good at. And there are alternatives to CRISPR that predate it and that postdate it. And I think, I think it's something that really doesn't matter. And also, all the companies are going to cross-license anyway. So, there are 3 perfectly viable CRISPR companies within a few blocks of each other in Cambridge that are just going forward, each with their own set of founders, and I'm involved in 2 of them, and it's just doesn't matter.
So it's a fake controversy that the media created because the headline looks good that someone stole genetic engineering.
I think it's true. I think the media correctly realizes that the average citizen can't relate to the nuances of exactly how we engineer the PAM site of CRISPR, or how we avoid off targets, or the software that's required. But they can understand the human drama, he said, she said drama. And it's the same with the Genome Project. It's the corporation versus the Kumbaya international collaboration. Those have a human interest story that's more palatable, and it accomplishes the goal of getting a lot of people talking about science. Admittedly, they're really talking about people. But it's that sort of thing that the younger generation will get, even the older is just saying, wow, this is drama.
Young whippersnappers these days.
Hey, why is there this drama? And they'll read about it. It's the way I was inspired by Cape Canaveral in Florida.
What else inspired you? Was there certain scientists, sci-fi, et cetera, that really drove you down this?
Yeah, so I didn't have any scientists or science or engineering in my life until I was about 13. For some reason, it wasn't taught in the schools that I was in that I can remember. And I was a rather poor reader as well as dyslexic, and so I mostly learned from picture books or pictures in books. But I was inspired by biographies. My mom would read biographies to me, or tell me about them. And so Madame Curie and Einstein and the usual. Luther Burbank was one of my favorites. I would go out and graft trees, the branches together in the yard. That was very inspiring to me.
What would you say if you could leave a message with kids?
Kids?
Yeah.
Today's kids? I think synthetic biology is a great field. It's like plastics in The Graduate movie. I would say take care of your environment, be inspired by nature, but not limited by it. Get some of us off the planet safely. Those would probably be some of my messages. Be nice to your colleagues, your friends.
I like that quote, be inspired by nature, but not constrained by it. I don't know if you've coined that, but that would be a good one right there.
Well, let's coin it then.
Yeah, let's coin it. So let's go for a hard question. You're 65. If we're going to be brutally honest and hard, what's your over-under line in terms of what you think and what you expect the technology will help you achieve?
Well, the first thing is I expect to have a lot more years to achieve it. So it's not 65 is not what it used to be, at least from my viewpoint.
Oh no, that's the absolute point. I'm not saying 65 is old.
Yeah, no, and I'm not. So I don't think there's necessarily a limited time frame. I also am not sure that a lot of things that we're worrying about, including climate change, are necessarily that hard from a technological standpoint. I mean, and even the political, a lot of things that seem hard politically, if you come up with the right technology, suddenly it changes. So, for example, what seemed like imminent starvation from Malthus all the way forward was solved by things like, the Carl Bosch's nitrogen fixation into fertilizer, and new generations of wheat and corn and rice, which allowed us to at least double our population over the Malthusian expectations. So what can be done? What can a 65-year-old who's just barely finally getting up to speed do? I think we see a lot can be done in 5 or 10 years. I mean, so the revolutions in reading, writing, and editing, each of which were less than a decade, most of the progress, 10 million-fold reduction in cost and improvement in quality for reading and writing, and about 10,000-fold, a more modest improvement in editing. And I think these can continue to improve and impact all fields even beyond biology. I think everything that's currently manufactured without biology, we're going to be thinking long and hard about whether it could be made better, smarter. Materials that are currently dumb materials like steel, every square centimeter could be as smart as a cockroach, or smarter.
How do you design something like that?
Smart materials, well, I mean, again, it's nature inspired. So our skin is incredibly good at keeping bacteria out and self-healing. And so you basically ask, can we make things out of skin? Can we, photosynthetic objects are even easier because they're lower maintenance than, say, mammalian skin. We can turn photons into information. We do that, even little insects will do that. We can turn that information into DNA. Our lab has shown that. So in principle, insect eyes could be ubiquitous. They could be incorporated into a whole variety of biologically manufactured materials. And then you've got a lot of intelligence there that's really just grafting an insect eye into or plant photoreceptors into a material that would be like wallpaper or upholstery.
Any prospect for photosynthesis for humans? I hear that if you eat enough plants, you can get a very, very minuscule calorie boost.
There are almost every major phylum of animals has an example of a species that has chloroplasts in its or something equivalent photosynthesis in its surface. They're usually pretty modest benefits, and you can calculate how much of it, even with the most efficient photosynthesizer, which are certain cyanobacteria, which have doubling time of 2.5 hours, you'd still need so many square meters of extra skin that you'd look more like a dragon than like a human. Or maybe you'd look like an umbrella or something. But I don't. It doesn't strike me as a high priority just yet.
So your undergrads come to you. They've solved human editing. They've created the ability to do X. What superpower does George Church want, and why?
Well, most of the superpowers we already have relative to our ancestors. I can see everything from gamma rays to radio waves, the entire electromagnetic spectrum, not just 400 to 700 nanometers. I can fly. I can go around the world in a short period of time. The only things that are really left for biological superpowers is health and intelligence, maybe wisdom. And most of those are still tantalizingly out of reach. I don't think they're millennia away. I think they're more like years away. But those would be the superpowers that I would be looking, the few superpowers we don't already have. Certainly the ones having to do with space exploration, those would be considered just ordinary health for people in space, they might be considered superpowers to our ancestors.
What would it take for you to volunteer to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I may not be the best candidate unless even if we had serious aging reversal, I still you could argue that society has invested too much in me for me to go bungee jumping or parachuting without jumping out of a plane with a parachute. But if it became very routine and low, very low risk, then I would probably do it. I just, yeah. This is not about me. I was taught as a young person to serve everybody else first before you eat, and I think that I would like to make it feasible for a lot of people that are highly motivated to colonize other worlds to do so.
I think you just brought up a really interesting point accidentally by saying that society has too much invested in you for you to go bungee jumping. Do you think about that? How do you think about risk in terms of your own day-to-day life with the type of work that you're working on?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not congenitally risk averse. I mean, I took any risk. I got I destroyed a couple of bicycle helmets. I got a concussion. Done vertical face rock climbing. But I do feel like it's irresponsible for me to take arbitrary risks at this point. They should be more calculated. Like, for example, being guinea pig number one in the Personal Genome Project, where I'm the one that tests the punch biopsy. That's not something that's going to kill me or make me a mental vegetable. It's just going to save pain and suffering in the other patients in the study. So I think that's a reasonable risk. Putting my medical records and genome in the public domain, some people would consider risky, but again, that's not a life-threatening risk. But being the first person to land on Mars would probably be an unacceptable risk based on what we know right now. Although I have to say the safety record for space has been extraordinary. I mean, the motto "failure is not an option," which does not apply to my field, certainly was a motto at NASA, and it probably still is.
Yeah, all things considered, it's quite an impressive feat to make rides go that far with such few hiccups.
Yeah, yeah.
So we've taken a lot of your time. I know you're a busy, busy guy. I have one last question for you, and that's if you wanted to leave listeners with something, a quote, a call to action, it can be anything. What would it be and why?
Well, I think that we need to be nice to each other and be thoughtful about the future, including thinking of what win-win solutions, where it's not me versus them, but there's a way where we can float all the boats. And I think there are technological win-win solutions very often where there are not political solutions, or you could consider technological as a way of finessing the political one. And this includes getting preventative healthcare, preventative being far more cost effective than cures and more equitably distributed, including vaccines, getting your genome sequence, avoiding Mendelian diseases. I think carbon sequestration, these should be high priorities. And they don't necessarily involve belt tightening. On the contrary, they involve filling up the bellies of people that are currently impoverished and making them creating a virtuous cycle so they don't have to spend so much time on their health problems of their family. They can spend more time on educating their children, both boys and girls, and then those educated citizens can participate in the whole conversation worldwide.
Yeah, just imagine if whatever you're spending each year was, I don't know, 50% less on healthcare, 75% less. That's a lot of discretionary time, money, and let's face it, if you're feeling better, when you feel like crap or you feel good, your world is a world of hurt different.
Exactly. And it's acting not just to you, but to your whole village, to your whole family.
Yeah, it's like when you lose your mind, it hurts your family. When you lose your body, it kills you. It's really hard the way that people age and a lot of the issues we have. Thanks for what you're doing. If people want to get involved, they want to learn more about you, they want to send you some money to make it happen, or in some way, shape, or form, find out more about George Church, where is the best place?
Google search will lead you to my website, which is at Harvard. Personal Genome Project is international and certainly could use some help. But yeah, act locally, think globally.
Act locally, think globally, and do something. I like it. Thanks for coming today, George.
Yes. Keep disrupting.
Yeah, we will keep disrupting. You keep disrupting in a humble way. Geez. Thanks for doing this.
Take care. Yeah.
Take care.